All right, welcome back. Our discussion today is going to focus squarely on the Second World War. It's the costliest war in all of human history. There's going to be a lot of military history involved with this, so hopefully you're ready for that. We're going to have to detail, obviously, the diplomatic maneuverings and what's going on with this. There's going to be some social history that takes place. We're going to be dealing with all of this going around the world, so there's really nothing left to do but get right into it. When we were talking before about the run-up to World War II, really in a lot of ways, especially when we're talking about with Europe, it's the aggressiveness of Nazi Germany that really is at the heart of this. And by the fall of 1939, Germany had promised, one, not to take over any new territories, and two, was working really, really hard to try to get new territory from the country of Poland. Poland had been created at least partially out of what had been Germany at the end of World War I, and part of Germany had actually been isolated away from itself around the city of Danzig, which is now the modern Polish city of Gdansk. And they wanted a corridor. They wanted a corridor to be able to get through to this territory on land instead of just having to go around on the North Sea the way that they had gone before. And so the Poles, no, we're not going to give up any of our territory. You want like a third of our country, and I don't think so. And so Britain and France had said, no, okay, Germany, you've taken over too many places already. If you attack Poland, we're going to declare war on you. And of course, Hitler has absolutely no reason to believe that they're going to do this, but that's exactly what's going to happen. And so in September 1939, Hitler's going to unleash the Panzers, right? And the Germans are going to invade Poland here in what's called Operation Fall Ice, right? And this attack here on Poland in 1939, the strategic goal here of the French and the British was, okay, if the Germans move east, then we'll be able to attack Germany in the west. The French and the British were not under any illusions that the Poles were going to somehow beat the Germans. That's not what they were hoping for. They were hoping that the Poles, with a couple of million men in their army, would tie up the Germans long enough for the Allies to get their forces mobilized and move in on Germany's western border. The idea that they had was that, well, Poland should be able to keep Germany occupied for about 6 months, and that would give us more than enough time to move on to Germany's relatively undefended western border, since if all the German troops are in the east, then they can't be in the west. The problem with this was it didn't take Germany 6 months to beat Poland, it took Germany 3 weeks. The reason for this was these new battle tactics that the Germans had been installing for really since the end of World War and since the end of World War I, and in some respects, at least in terms of the infantry use, since the latter half of the First World War, right? It was called by British journalists Blitzkrieg. It's not the Germans that actually come up with the German name. It is British journalists that do this. Blitzkrieg literally translates to lightning war, right? And so this is going to be one of the realities that the Allies are going to have to deal with, especially in the first half of World War II, and that is they're going to have to be dealing with a very aggressive Germany that's armed with sort of new ways of thinking about fighting. Now the rationale behind Blitzkrieg owes its genesis back to the immediate post-World War I period. German military planners are really smarting from their defeat and are having to get ready for, what do we have to fight again with this? And the problem that they had in fighting World War I was we had a really big army, and we're trying to match our big army against their big army, and they had this big power struggle. Right? The trenches of World War I on the Western Front is a good sort of example of this. We try to throw our power against their power, and of course we were overmatched. Right? They had too many people. We fought a war of attrition, and they won. So power is not the right way to go. Plus, they're not going to be able to do that since their army had been eviscerated by the Treaty of Versailles. So, okay, we're going to be a smaller army. What advantages do small armies have? Well, one of the advantages is speed. Since they're able to start over from scratch, right, they focus on speed and the use of speed to form its own sort of power base. They're also going to incorporate new technologies like tanks, trucks, airplanes, and even paratroopers dropped from aircraft. Right? The way that this worked was Blitzkrieg called for massive bombardment of an enemy line at one point, right, over a relatively short period of time, with air attacks in the rear areas, and then a breakthrough by tanks at one small point. The Germans refer to this as the Schwerpunkt, right? The heavy point. American military planners refer to this as the center of gravity, but it's the same idea, right? Now, once they're through, the tanks, they don't turn back and fight these guys fighting the front lines. They keep on going. They keep on going and they attack the rear areas, the headquarters, the railroad depots, lines of communication, right? And they would be followed on by infantry in vehicles that can move just as fast as the tank can, that are going to capture as much of this rear area as possible. It's going to undercut all these guys at the front and force them to fall back so you don't have to fight them at all. Here's a Polish battle map of a double envelopment blitzkrieg attack, where most of the attacks focus not on the guys fighting at the front, because they're dug in, they got heavy weapons, they got machine guns, they got cannons, they got stuff like that. Now you're going to attack this railroad depot and headquarters position in the rear, because a tank is pretty good against a guy who's dug in. It's going to be really good against some fat supply sergeant who's only armed with a pencil on a clipboard. And so that's what's going to be the idea behind this. Now I swiped this little scene from a video game. It's called Blitzkrieg, right? But it gives you basically the idea where you've got tanks and infantry, paratroopers and aircraft. They're all working in conjunction with each other. One of the things that the Germans did was they made sure that every vehicle had a radio. Every platoon of infantry had a radio. They're constantly going to be in contact with each other, so that way they'll know exactly what's going on. Good example of this, how much thought the Germans put into this, was the Stuka, the Stutzkampfflieger dive bomber, the Ju-87. It was actually, this gull wing design was purchased from the United States, and it was an extremely effective pinpoint tactical bomber that the Germans are going to use really for a number of purposes. Early on in the war, they're going to drop bombs from it. Later in the war, they'll actually fit a couple of anti-tank guns under the wings for the Ju-87G, where they can shoot tanks in the roof. And so it's a pretty versatile little aircraft. And they also even fitted it with the cows with these sirens, so that when it would go into these steep dives, it would make this sort of screaming noise that when you listen to World War II movies and things like that, and you hear in the background, you know, the sound of that comes from this, and it was designed to demoralize troops that are getting bombed, and it was actually pretty effective at this. And so here you can see Blitzkrieg in practice. When the troops were in an open territory, the tanks generally took the lead. They've got very powerful weapons, very heavy armor, but when you go into more wooded or closed terrain, where you got hills and rocks and trees and things like that, then the infantry goes out and protects the tanks, and then they get back in their vehicles, whether it's trucks or half-tracks, but they're all moving together. The use of motorcycles for long-range reconnaissance and things like that, this is how it all worked itself together. Well, following Poland's very, very quick capitulation, Britain and France are kind of shocked into inaction. They don't exactly know what they're going to do. They hadn't planned on the fact that Hitler's forces are going to be able to move so quickly and take over countries so rapidly. So they lose their nerve to attack Hitler in the fall and in the winter of 1939-1940, and so what they do is they go onto the defensive. This is really a huge strategic mistake. This is one thing that the German, or the British newspapers, they jokingly refer to as the Sitzkrieg, or the sitting war. They're going to hide behind prepared defenses, such as the Maginot Line that the French had constructed on their eastern border against the Germans. And so they're going to rely on a static defense, and then they're going to wait and see what the Germans are going to do. What that does is it gives the German military planners all winter long to come up with an attack plan, and the one that they come up with is pretty impressive. So here you can see some Allied soldiers, and they are having some fun at the expense of the fact that they're not doing anything, and they're doing the Sitzkrieg. They're just kind of sitting around. They're going to Berlin. Here we come, Adolf, but they're not actually going anywhere, right? And this is one of the ones that ran in these British newspapers here in the winter of 1939-1940, right? So here's the Maginot Line. This is the line of these forts that the French would construct, thinking that this would keep the Germans out, and it turns out no, right? Well, the plan that the Germans come up with is called Fallgelb, right? Operation Yellow, or Plan Yellow. And this is the attack on France, right? Now, the Germans are going to use aerial reconnaissance, right? And knowledge of the fact that the Allies don't tend to react well to surprises, and they come up with a plan to fake out the Allied armies, right? The idea is not unlike the way that you would see a bullfighter fight a bull. Bullfighter has a couple of weapons at his disposal. He's got the cape, and he's got the sword, or he's got the spear, and the idea is pretty basic. You wave the cape in front of the bull's head, the bull goes off to the side and exposes his neck, and you stab it. And that's exactly what the Germans are going to do to the Anglo French forces here in World War II. So the Germans are going to fake an attack into Belgium, very much like they did during World War I. The Germans had marched into Belgium to try to get to France, and so it's going to look like, okay, they're repeating themselves again. Of course, Belgium looks like good tank country. Well, if an army that the Germans are relying on has a lot of tanks, well, then Belgium is the place to go. So when a small diversionary force goes into Belgium here in 1940, hey, this looks like the main attack, we're going to go after these guys. But in fact, the main attack is going to take place in the Ardennes Forest, which is narrow, heavily wooded, lots of rocks. There's no way that the Germans are going to be able to get through there with tanks and trucks and half-tracks and things like that. And it turns out that, yeah, that's exactly what's going to take place. The main attack is going to break across the Meuse River at Sedan here in May of 1940, right? But this is going to be at the same time that the main Allied armies are rushing north and east into Belgium. To put this into perspective, when Hitler launches his invasion into the Soviet Union, Stalin had for a long time said, no, Hitler's not going to attack me. Hitler's not going to attack me. But as soon as the tanks crossed the frontier and started attacking him, he realized he had been fooled, right? The United States, in December of 1941, they were saying, well, Japan may attack us somewhere, but, you know, the Philippines, Singapore, you know, on the high seas, something like that, right? Once the bombs started falling on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, they realized immediately they had been fooled. It takes the Allies, it takes the French and the British 4 days to figure out that the Germans have fooled them. That in fact the main attack is not in Belgium, that it's at Sedan. By then, it was too late anyway. But they counted on the fact that the Allies would be even slower, that they were still using World War I techniques, which was, you know, you go forward, you consolidate your position, you go forward, you consolidate your position, and you use these sort of methods. There was nothing in there for, okay, what if something radically new happens? Well, let's move quickly to meet it. Now, they didn't. They knew that the British and the French didn't have anything in their planning tables for that. And so the Germans are counting on the slow reaction, and that's exactly what takes place. So map here gives you a good idea. Here's the feint into Belgium, and then here's the main breakthrough that takes place around Sedan, and then they're going to curl around and they're going to trap these guys in a pocket in Belgium around the city of Dunkirk. So once they break through at Sedan, they don't turn around and attack these guys. They break through and they continue to encircle the Allies' armies, and they drive all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. By June of 1940, the British and many of the French forces that haven't been able to get away are hidden into this huge pocket in northern Belgium near the city of Dunkirk, and now they are trapped. You've got the Germans on 3 sides, and you've got the ocean on the 4th side, right? Britain is going to, under the auspices of the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, they're going to organize a very hasty withdrawal by sea. This is Operation Dynamo. And they're going to use any boats that they have at their disposal to try to get over to the Belgian coastline and withdraw these Allied forces as quickly as possible. This is going to include Navy destroyers, cruise ships, private yachts, even fishing boats. If you could get across the channel and you could pick these guys up back and forth, the British government asked you to do this, right? Now, they managed to save most of the men. This is an extraordinary success in humanitarian terms, but they're going to lose essentially all of their heavy equipment. No trucks, no half-tracks, no heavy artillery, no heavy machine guns. None of this kind of stuff is going to get evacuated. France also now is going to stand completely alone because the British Expeditionary Force is going to have retreated all the way back to England. So here's some scenes. This is Dunkirk being bombed by the Luftwaffe, by the German Air Force, and the French soldiers, British soldiers are all being embarked onto these ships as hastily as possible to get away from the advancing German armies. So without Britain's help, and of course a lot of its army had either surrendered already or had been evacuated to Britain, France has absolutely no chance against the German blitzkrieg through the rest of June of 1940. The Germans are going to break through the French lines into metropolitan France, and they are going to set up a collaborationist government in the south with the capital of Vichy. The Germans are going to force the French to sign the armistice in the exact same rail car that they had forced the Germans to sign at the end of World War I. Hitler is crowned as this great conquering hero, and here you can see German troops are marching through the streets of Paris, through the Champs-Élysées. You can see the visceral, emotional reaction of French citizens as they're seeing their country occupied by foreign troops. It's pretty understandable why they'd be upset and they'd be crying at this kind of thing, but that's what the Germans are going to do. One of the favorite things for Hitler to do was to go to the Eiffel Tower and have his picture taken in front of it. Right? He had done in 6 weeks what all the years of fighting in World War I had been unable to do, and that was he was able to capture Paris. And so Hitler is a big hero to the German people as a result of that. Well, one of the guys that I mentioned briefly before, and I mentioned at the end of last time, was British politician Winston Churchill, right? The Chamberlain government had been the government of appeasement, right? Give Hitler what he wants and hopefully he'll go away, right? In fact, what you're going to see here is in the middle of the fighting in 1940, Chamberlain's government is going to collapse. Members of Parliament realize Chamberlain doesn't know what he's doing, okay? And in fact, this guy, Churchill, who had been saying, we need to go after Hitler, we need to take the fight to him, we need to not back down, they had been deriding him as a warmonger. All of a sudden, hey, Churchill, why don't you save us? And that's exactly what's going to happen. Churchill is going to be named as the new Prime Minister of Britain, but he is going to start off his tenure inheriting a giant mess, one of the great debacles of all time. Britain's armies were surrounded here in France, and they're only barely saved. Okay? At this point, when the Germans overrun the rest of France, they initiate some peace overtures at this point, and when you consider the situation that Britain is in at this point, Germany's air force, the Luftwaffe, is unmatched in Europe at this point. They were increasingly stepping up attacks against England. So you've got enemy bombers over your cities dropping bombs. You have German submarines that are ranging around the island, sinking your ships. Okay? And so when these Germans issue these sort of peace overtures, okay, look, we've defeated France, Britain, all right? You guys, you Brits, okay, it's time to come to the peace table. You know, let's talk about, you know, ending the war. We've defeated the French, fighting's over. Let's call it quits. Churchill says no. Okay? Germans, wait a minute. Now you think about it a little while, because we got this massive army. Your army's just been defeated. It doesn't have any heavy equipment. We captured it all in France. And we'll just put our guys on boats and we'll just sail across the channel and we'll conquer your little country because it doesn't have much of an army. We'll bomb it, right? We'll trap it with our U-boats and then we'll invade it with our army. This right here is probably the best response that you can get when you look at Winston Churchill. No. Right? And there you go, right? The defiant Winston Churchill, right? Who refuses to back down from these Nazi overtures of peace, despite the fact that at this point of the war, England was a lot like a minnow, and the Nazis who had overrun almost all of Western Europe were like a whale, and they were threatening to swallow them, right? Instead, Churchill's response again is no. I refuse to surrender. He promised that Britain would fight them everywhere. They'd fight them on the beaches, they'd fight them in the fields, they'd fight them wherever they came on, all right? So, Hitler sort of half-hearted jest that they were going to have to, you know, invade the island. He's going to have to actually invade the island. So he set plans for Operation Sea Löwe, right? And Operation Sea Lion, right? Is going to have to go forward. Now, one of the realities that Germany's going to have to contend with is the fact that they cannot outmatch the British Navy. The German Navy's not going to, their battleships and destroyers aren't going to be able to brush the British Navy out of the way. So what are you going to have to do to get them out of the way to get an invasion fleet across the channel? Well, one of the things that the Germans have, of course, is their air force. You can bomb ships from the air. In fact, you can bomb ships from the air really, really well. Okay. The problem with this is, of course, then the Royal Air Force. The Royal Air Force isn't going to just sit idly by while you bomb the Navy. Okay. So what that means is you're going to have to knock out both the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, and Germany is going to come perilously close. They're going to come perilously close to being able to do both of these. What's going to happen here is the resultant is called the Battle of Britain, and it's going to ensue from July through August of 1940, and this is the first battle in human history that's going to take place entirely in the air. The Germans are going to be trying to bomb the RAF and the Royal Navy into submission. The RAF basically has time on their side, because by the time you get to about late August, September, the English Channel gets so choppy that invasion boats with men and tanks and things like that you need a flat sea to be able to get across. And they're going to be able to do this. They're going to hold on by their fingernails. They're going to use radar. They're going to use every sort of measure that they have to try to defend their country. And eventually, by September, Hitler is forced to call off Operation Sea Lion and the planned invasion of Britain. And as a result of that, Churchill had this to say about these guys, flying these planes, shooting down these Germans, and trying to fight these guys off as best as they could, that never in the course of human history have so many owed so much to so few. So, all right, well, as we get into the latter part of 1940 and in the early part of 1941, Hitler's got kind of a problem. He's still at war with England, but there's no real way to attack England directly, right? He had captured Denmark, he had captured Norway. You invade those countries, you take them over, you invade France, but you can't just march an army into England. So they can't really get at him, he can't get at them. What do you do? Well, Hitler basically determined that he kind of isolated Britain, and they can't really do him a whole lot of damage. And so he decides to basically turn his U-boat fleet loose on them, and hopefully that the submarines will force them to give in, because they'll starve them out for supplies, oil, troops, things like that. Right? His main problem on the continent of Europe had always been the Soviet Union. Hitler had long talked about how he hated communism, how he hated the social order. He regarded the Russians, the Slavic people, as these subhumans that he was going to subjugate. He wanted to take over their agriculture, their industry, their oil, all these resources that Germany lacked. Hitler determined that the best way to get them was to just invade an army into these countries and take them over. And so this plan had been sort of percolating in Hitler's mind, and he started seriously planning for it. And eventually in June of 1941, that is what is going to take place. On June 22nd, he launches Operation Barbarossa. This is named after one of the medieval kings of the Holy Roman Empire, right? And the blitzkrieg against Russia is extremely successful, right? Stalin and Hitler had a non-aggression pact. They promised not to attack each other, and like I had said before, Hitler always kept his word unless he had made a promise, right? He had promised Stalin not to attack him, and of course, that meant that Hitler was going to attack him, right? The problem with overall strategic success in Russia is that the Russian landmass is ridiculously huge, right? Flat, open real estate, and so Hitler's forces would go on, and they would capture these huge pockets of these Russian troops, hundreds of thousands of guys, and they do the machine gun down, or they take them as prisoners of war, and then there was more of them constantly coming. You have a huge population disadvantage in terms of what the Russians are able to field, but also you just have a massive amount of real estate that whenever Hitler would defeat these guys, they could always retreat further and further into the interior. All right. By the middle of the summer, right, Hitler's forces are extremely victorious, but he's unsure about, well, where exactly are we going to go? Finally, he's going to settle on the main objective, which is what the main objective should have been from the start, and that's attacking the Russian capital of Moscow. Not only is it the political capital, but also all the roads, all the telephone lines, all the railroad lines are going to run through the hub of Moscow. And capturing it would have been really probably the death knell of the Soviet Union. This is going to give the Soviets, though, just enough time in order to marshal their forces. So that as the Germans are continuing to head eastward, they're running shorter and shorter of men and equipment. And as time plays on, we're going to see the weather's going to get colder and colder until eventually the snows outside of Moscow and Siberian reinforcements stop the Germans just outside of Moscow in December of 1941. So by the end of 1941, Hitler is in control of almost all of continental Europe, either directly through military conquest or through a number of people who have decided to ally themselves with Hitler rather than try to face his wrath. And so this is going to be a major problem. So you can see the arrows on the map extending all the way out to all these various places that Hitler had conquered and taken over. You can see Denmark and Norway, Yugoslavia and Greece that had been directly conquered. Then you have the Allies in southeastern Europe. Only Britain, and at this point Russia, or at least part of Russia, is going to be offering any resistance. Now, our popular image that we have of this is that the Nazis roll into your town, and these guys, they sort of grit their teeth and they foment this rebellion against the Germans, and they'll do what they can. They fight in these little resistance movements. That's really, in a lot of cases, more fantasy than fact. Okay, a lot of people realize that they're just going to have to put up with the Nazis in their area, and in fact, most of them don't offer resistance. We're going to find more people that are going to be willing to work with Nazi conquerors than are going to be willing to actively work against them. Now, a lot of people may have been upset about it personally, but that doesn't mean they were willing to, grab a rifle and roam around the streets at night shooting German officers. This couples with the fact that a lot of people in a lot of different places were still very active in the ideas of pre-World War II political circles, which is, no, autocracy is better than democracy. We need strong central government rather than liberalism. And so, in this case, what we've seen is, in a lot of ways, Hitler's government, where he actually succeeds in fusing nationalism with socialism, is going to be pretty pervasive. And a lot of people are pointing to Germany's military conquests to this idea. Say, look how successful this Hitler guy is. He's taken over Europe. This is the way to go. Okay? Many people are going to argue that, in fact, Hitler's type of government is better than their old type. A lot of these people, for various reasons, are going to collaborate with the German occupiers. Now, some of them are going to do this simply for food, for jobs. You'll see women in various towns, they'll become girlfriends of German officers and things like that just to kind of get the extra food that these guys can bring in. I don't know how you want to feel about that, but a lot of people are going to take, a lot of these Czech workers, they're going to take jobs inside German factories so that way they can make extra money. Does that make them Nazis? Does that make them bad people? I don't know. I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm just saying that a lot more people were willing to work with the Nazis than we were originally sort of willing to say. We're willing to kind of think about. We always think these people are these sort of heroic anti-Nazi resistance types. There are some of these people, though. Right? Now, some, not as many, really hate German occupation, and they're going to actively resist the Germans by really any means necessary. They're going to attack them at night. They're going to blow up their pieces of equipment. They're going to sabotage railway lines. And as this movement gets more and more attention, they will be aided by the Allies as surreptitiously as possible. So you can see some of the members of the Greek resistance. Here's some of the members of the French Maquis, and they're being assisted by a British special forces guy who's been dropped into France to help coordinate the overall Allied war effort with what's going on with these guys. But for the most part, you're going to have collaborators with this. So the French, right, helping the Germans round up Jews for the final solution. This is going to be Quisling. He is the Nazi leader of Nazi-occupied Norway. This is Marshal Pétain, who is going to be installed with the French puppet government, the Vichy government. He's shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. And so this is what's going on with these guys, right? I mentioned this briefly before. We need to go into a lot of detail now. And that is Hitler had a long-standing antipathy towards Jewish people in Europe. He blamed them for all sorts of problems. And this is concomitant with an overall sort of general European anti-Semitic view. The Jews had had lots of problems in lots of different places. The Germans were very anti-Semitic. You're going to see that the Russian czars for a long time had a long-standing anti-Semitic policies that had forced a lot of Jews to flee Europe at various points. And so military conquest plus the collaboration of a lot of local non-Jewish populations is going to give Hitler access to large numbers of these people that Hitler absolutely hated, and that was the Jews. Germans began exporting these captured Jews to concentration camps in 1940. Now, it's important to understand the evolution of how this goes from we're going to treat you people like prisoners to we're going to treat you as just sort of lambs to the slaughter, right? The initial thing that they're going to do with them, putting them in concentration camps, these are basically just outdoor, giant sort of outdoor jails, all right? And they're going to turn them for the most part into slave laborers with this. Hitler, though, begins to order their systematic execution, right? The Germans are going to strive for ways to kill these people as efficiently as possible. The Germans have a long-standing sort of stereotype that they're these super sort of efficient, very precise kind of minded people, and they're gonna apply a lot of that engineering thought to, well, how do we kill these people as quickly as possible? We can try to shoot them, but even if you shoot them, it's going to be a lot of bullets, it's going to be a lot of death. How do we get rid of these guys? It turns out that the one that they're going to eventually settle on is the gas chamber. These big sort of rooms, you pump them with this cyanide gas, and it's going to be the most efficient, with the bodies, generally speaking, burnt after death. Ironically, Hitler would buy the gas chambers that he would use for against the Jews, and then also Poles and various other groups of people. He's going to buy these from the Soviet Union. He's going to buy them from Stalin, because Stalin had already gassed so many of his own people that I got more gas chambers than I need now. So let that kind of sink in for a little bit. All in all, some 12 million people are going to die in the Holocaust. Okay, this is going to be political prisoners against Hitler, subhuman people that Hitler just didn't feel were fit to live, and 6 million of these are going to be Jews. All right. So here you can see some German guys are hassling this Jewish guy on the streets of some occupied town in Europe. Eventually, it would be put behind barbed wire and forced to work as slave laborers, and then they are massively slaughtered. Here you can see American forces are touring one of these death camps. They've disinterred the bodies to try to begin to identify them, so hopefully that they can be, some information can be passed along to their families for things like this. And a lot of these guys were simply worked and starved to death before they were even actually physically put to death, all right? Now, one of the countries we haven't talked a lot about, really much at all in this so far, has been the United States. Ironically, it's going to be Japan. It's going to bring the United States into this conflict, where Hitler is the sort of major threat to the world. Japan, though, had been making a number of aggressive moves in East Asia, where they're trying to take over all these countries to try to gain the same sort of economic autarky that the Germans were trying to gain in Europe. Japan needed mineral resources, they needed oil, they needed rubber, they needed all these things, and so they're going to take over these places to try to get them. They had already attacked China, they were engaged in a war with that. So finally, these aggressive moves in East Asia forces the United States to cut off trade with them, right? The United States was the #1 supplier at that point to Japan of steel and oil. And so without steel and oil, Japan's not going to have a military. You don't have aircraft carriers and tanks and machine guns without steel and oil. And so the Japanese realized that at this point, they're going to have to make a choice. They can either let the United States kind of starve them of the military supplies that they're going to need and force them to the negotiating table, say, okay, you don't have a military anymore, you got to do what we say. Or they're going to have to fight the United States. Japanese military planners decide, well, we're going to have to fight the United States. Okay? This seems like kind of a crazy proposition, and in some ways it kind of is. But the plan they come up with is probably the best one that they had available, given the decision to fight. And that was, you're going to have to attack the United States in such a devastating way that it will not be able to get back at you, at least not in any kind of quick manner. All right? Now, a lot of conspiracy theory ink has been spilled on the idea, well, President Roosevelt, he knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he let it go ahead anyway because he'd have a good excuse to fight the Japanese. No. All right? The United States does expect an attack. They do understand that the Japanese have strong motives to go and attack them, but it's probably going to come in a place where it's colonies that are very close to Japan that aren't nearly as militarily important. Most likely scenario they have with the Philippine Islands. Okay? The reason the United States does not expect an attack in Hawaii is it's thousands of miles inside U.S. territory, it's heavily defended, and of course the attack itself would have to use technology that not everybody in the United States Navy was sure would work, and that was carrier-based aircraft dropping bombs and torpedoes on the fleet and the support elements on land. And not everybody was sure that was going to work, right? That is in fact exactly what the Japanese were planning. The reason that this isn't a good idea, if FDR knew about this, you don't have to have them devastate your #1 fortress in the Pacific and push you all the way back to California for your repair and refit facilities in order to have an excuse to enter the war. You can just have a ship or two sunk for that. It would be sort of like saying that you need an excuse to fight some guy, so you're going to let him shoot you in the head first to prove that you didn't throw the first punch. It's not a good idea. Okay, it's not a good idea if you're FDR and say, oh yeah, attack Pearl Harbor, blow it away. What are you going to fight him with? Yeah, not a good idea for this. This is in fact what is going to go forward. This is gun camera footage from one of the lead Japanese bombers over Pearl Harbor, Battleship Row, on December 7th of 1941. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. In the early morning hours, the Japanese planes are going to zoom low over and around the mountains of Hawaii, and they're going to hit the U.S. fleet around 8 a.m. on Sunday morning. They're going to catch the United States completely off guard. There were 3 levels of code that the lead Japanese pilot was supposed to signal back to the fleet. Either, 1, the United States is not fooled. They knew we were here, their planes are in the air, we're going to have to fight our way through to the objectives. So that was basically no surprise. The second level, which was, okay, we've achieved a certain level of surprise, but the Americans know we're here, their planes aren't in the air yet, so we're going to have some fighting to do before we can get to the objectives. And then the third one is, okay, we've achieved complete surprise. No planes are in the air, the Americans have no idea that we're here. And that's the one that he would signal back, and that would be Tiger, Tiger, Tiger was the code in Japanese. It was Tora, Tora, Tora. And so that's exactly what he's going to signal back, and the United States is going to take an utterly devastating beating. Right? The Japanese are going to sink these ships, they're going to damage several others, they're going to destroy most of these planes on the ground, and they're going to kill over 1,500 people in the initial wave, and something like another 1,800 would die as a result of this. The next day, President Roosevelt is going to ask Congress to declare war on the Empire of Japan. This provides an interesting problem, though, for the Allies, and that is, this was Japan. Hitler is threatening to overrun Europe. You got to remember, in December of 1941, Hitler's forces are knocking on the door of Moscow. There's no guarantee that the Russians are even going to be able to stop him. And even beyond that, just because they stopped him in the winter of 1941, there's no thinking that anything other than when the snow thaws in the spring, they're going to just roll right into Moscow and just continue to finish the job. Hitler and Hirohito's government in Japan, they did have an alliance with one another. But the way that it worked was it was a defensive alliance. Basically, it was aimed at the United States, which was such as if the United States attacked either one of them, then the other would declare war on the United States. It was aimed at keeping the United States neutral. Well, the United States didn't attack Japan. Japan attacked the U.S. Hitler was under no obligation to declare war on the United States, but he decided, no, I'm allied with Japan, and so I'm going to declare war on the United States. It's a hard to explain decision. Some people said, well, his armies were being defeated in the East. Hitler was just saying, forget it, I'm going to declare war on the world. Some people said, no, he's thinking he's about to win the war in the East. He might as well go ahead and declare war on Japan. It's a decision that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And nobody but Adolf Hitler probably knows for sure. And since he's dead, we can't ask him, right? Well, here's some headlines of this Japanese bomb Honolulu, right? Of this kind of thing. There was actually a decent film on Pearl Harbor that had Ben Affleck in it, and other than the love scenes, which were actually ridiculously horrible, I remain unconvinced that they even liked each other, much less were in love with each other. The battle scenes were pretty good. They had Japanese and American planes doing some things that the laws of physics I don't think would necessarily allow. But generally speaking, the idea that what was going on with the Japanese bombing and what it looked like, it was pretty good. It was pretty well done. So if you ever get a chance to see Pearl Harbor, just fast forward through all the cheesy love crap and get to the action scenes, and I think you'll be pretty impressed with what's going on with this. Okay. Well, as we move the calendar forward here into 1942, the United States is at war, but it's not going to be able to throw its weight into the fighting immediately. And so somebody is going to have to stop the German war machine and defeat it. Well, the Russians had managed to stop the Germans, but really hadn't managed to beat these guys in late 1941. And so despite this check at Moscow, in the winter, a lot of people think in the spring of 1942, Hitler's army is just going to roll forward and capture Moscow. The Russians certainly did because they sent most of their forces to guard their capital. Instead, Hitler orders most of his army south into southern Russia to attack the Russian oil fields at the Caucasus Mountains. On the one hand, this serves kind of a double purpose. Okay, one, this would get oil to Hitler, which his armies badly need because there's not a lot of oil wells in Germany. Right? Two, this is going to deprive Russia of their oil wells. You deprive Russia of oil, they don't have an army. Okay? So this catches the Russians somewhat off guard, and you've got this nice sort of open field battles that take place where Russian forces again are encapsulated in these blitzkrieg-style assaults, and they're going to melt before Hitler's forces. But Hitler orders his troops to attack and capture the city of Stalingrad rather than trying to go around it and get across the Volga River some other way. Right? What's going to happen is Stalingrad was one of the biggest cities inside Russia, and there are a number of reasons why you would want to capture it. Obviously, one, it's named after Stalin, so you got a political sort of jab. Two, it commands the Volga River, and so you can stop the flow of oil that was taking place. But three, we're also going to see that it was a major tank manufacturing center for the Russians. For example, 25% of the Russian T-34 tanks used in World War II were manufactured at the tractor factory inside Stalingrad. So there are a number of these factories that were making war material, and if you can capture those, it makes a difference in terms of the fighting. The problem is the fighting itself, and that is the fighting turns into these bitter sort of street-to-street battles where every house becomes a bunker. They're sort of worming their way through the sewers. Every knockdown building becomes a defensible position. And the German army, which was really designed to kind of fight out in the open and be fast and be quick, doesn't really have the muscle to totally take over Stalingrad as a result of that. And we'll see that Stalingrad itself starts funneling more and more reinforcements into the city itself until eventually the German forces form the edge of this little snout that sticks way, way out. Here you can see some of the scenes of the fighting. These are Russian troops counterattacking across the destroyed city. Of course, all these artillery shells are knocking down buildings. All the aerial bombardments are knocking down houses. And so here's some Russian troops trying to go forward to recapture one of these factory complexes. They're led by a flame-throwing tank, the street-to-street fighting. And what we're going to see is Hitler's army is really worn down by this style of warfare and has actually strategically overextended their lines to try to capture Stalingrad. The Russians, when they manage to hold the line at Stalingrad, they begin reinforcing the area, but not directly in front of the Germans, off to the side. Okay? The Russians launch a double pincer attack on this sort of extended snout, and they will attack the Italian and the Romanian allies that are guarding the German flanks. Both of them are going to break through, and what that means is just like when you wrap your arms around another person, they're going to encircle the German 6th Army that is now occupying the western half of the city of Stalingrad. And so they're going to surround these guys, they're going to besiege them, and these guys are going to run out of ammunition, they're going to run out of reinforcements, they're going to run out of food. And so by January of 1943, we're going to see that the German 6th Army is forced to surrender. Overall, in terms of the fighting for Stalingrad, Hitler's going to lose 300,000 guys. This, you start throwing around big numbers, and what does that mean? Okay, 300,000, that's a lot. It would be a lot to try to fit in here, but 300,000 means that 1 out of every 10 German soldiers on the Eastern Front disappeared. He lost 10% of his army fighting Stalingrad. Okay, and so this is the one we had seen before. We see this long kind of snout had stuck out, and then the Germans get hit with this double pincer attack, where the Russians come in from the north and the south and are going to enclose these guys. Since this is February of 1943, the 100,000 or so that are left in Stalingrad are forced to surrender, and they're going to march themselves off into captivity, a particularly bitter captivity, I might add. Of the 100,000 that are going to march off to captivity, only 15,000 will survive to return home after World War II was over. Right? When we consider what's going on in the West, Germany's having trouble fighting Britain because, of course, Britain is not attached by land to the rest of the continent. And so in 1940 and 1941, Hitler, for the most part, had sent his naval forces to try to starve out the British military by U-boat attacks. Throughout this period, sometimes referred to as the happy time by German U-boat captains, they are very successful. In fact, throughout much of this, it looks like they're going to succeed in starving out Britain because they are sinking ships faster than the British can make them. Now, with Germany's declaration of war on the United States, on the one hand, this is going to bring the United States into the fighting to help the British out, but it also means that the fighting can now extend to the eastern seaboard of the United States, and that's exactly what the Germans are going to do. German U-boats range now from the coast of Maine all the way down to the mouth of the Mississippi River, fighting off the coast of Florida. There are going to be sinkings all over the place, and the German U-boat skippers would often refer to us as the second happy time, where they're going to start blowing up American vessels right off their coastline. What's going to happen, though, in this raging battle of the Atlantic is that improved detection technology and much greater use of aircraft at sea is going to turn the tide against the U-boats. Most people don't understand. They think of a submarine as it goes underwater and it kind of stays underwater forever. Modern submarines are like that. World War II submarines are more accurately described as a diving boat. Right? It can go underwater, but for the most part it still operates on the surface. And as it tries to get underwater, while you can't necessarily see it underwater, airplanes that are flying a few hundred feet in the air do have a pretty good view of it. And also a number of other things like radar, which we normally associate with using against aircraft, can also spy the conning tower on one of these things. A high-frequency detection finder can triangulate a U-boat's position when it sends a radio signal to other U-boats. And so eventually what we're going to see is this is going to turn the tide against the U-boats, and it's going to drive them almost completely out of the Atlantic by 1944. To put this into perspective, out of every 100 U-boat sailors that went to sea, 85 of them never returned. This was an all-volunteer force. I mean, nobody made you serve on a U-boat, but there was a really good chance that you were going to wind up on the bottom of the ocean as a result of that. So here you can see German U-boats are going crazy. They're sinking British vessels left and right. In the earlier periods of this. Here you can see some of the sinkings of these vessels in the mid-Atlantic as they're trying to destroy the shipping. But eventually the tide's going to turn against this. Here's a PBY flying boat dropping a depth charge on one of these U-boats, and here you can see another U-boat in the Caribbean that's being shelled and eventually will be forced to surrender. One of the major theaters of World War II is going to be North Africa. Right? And the reason that this fighting extends to there is because the Italians have been trying to gain control of North Africa, and they've been fighting the British, and generally speaking, the British hand the Italians their hats. Right? They beat the British up pretty badly, and so basically Hitler is forced to send some kind of reinforcement to this area. The guy that he decides to send in is Erwin Rommel, right? And Rommel is going to be in command of 3 divisions, the Africa Corps, to try to aid Mussolini. Now, Rommel's initial experience had been in charge of the 7th Panzer Division during the invasion of France in 1940. He's really one of the great armored generals of all time. And instead of merely bolstering the Italian line, Rommel decides that the best way to go about things is to smash the British army, maneuver through the desert, and try to cut them off. And he's in a series of lightning battles, both back and forth, that take place. Eventually, Rommel's forces are going to be pushing forward and actually threatens to invade Egypt. If you can brush aside the British 8th Army that is holding on to Egypt, the entire Middle East then opens up to the Germans, and you'll have all these oil fields of Iraq that are going to lay at the feet of the German military. The problem with this is logistics. Rommel's forces are hindered by a constant lack of supplies. British airplanes operating from the island of Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean often bombed his resupply ships before they could reach his forces in North Africa. So Rommel's army, after the Battle of El Alamein, are stalled. Stalled, but extremely dangerous, as potent forts in the eastern desert. So here you can see, this is Rommel's battle map as he's going forth. They go forward here. They outflanked these guys at Bir Hakeim. Eventually they would capture the fortresses of Tobruk and move on into the eastern desert. And so there's Rommel. He was a very active commander. He constantly at the front. You'll notice he's got some captured British goggles that he liked to show himself off in and ride around, keep the dust out of his eyes. He would often appear in a tank himself. Here's German 88mm anti-aircraft gun that was often pressed through the service as an anti-tank gun. Here's some German Panzer III tanks in the desert as they're maneuvering around. With this, Rommel had a tendency to throw kind of everything they had into the battle to maximize the firepower, whether it's anti-aircraft guns, whether it's tanks, whether it's infantry, whatever they have as they're maneuvering with these many places. This is the island of Malta, this tiny little place that's had a few squadrons of German or of British aircraft intercepting these German resupply routes from Italy. Proved to be a major thorn in Rommel's side, and these are these British airplanes patrolling the Mediterranean, trying to sink these ships. Right. So you've got Rommel. Is he going to be able to capture the Middle East? Not. He needs reinforcements. The British need reinforcements. What about the Americans? They joined this war effort, but a lot of people had wanted to be very cautious about confronting Hitler's armies directly. Africa represented a great opportunity to attack an isolated part of the German army, and you could track it. Between the British on the one side, the Americans on the other, the Mediterranean in the north, and the expansive Sahara Desert in the south. To this end, the Americans are going to launch Operation Torch, with British and American forces landing in northwest Africa near Algeria and Morocco. So what you've got now is Rommel caught like the meat in the sandwich. You've got the Americans and the Brits in the west, you've got the British 8th Army in the east, and you just squished Rommel together with this. The plan worked to almost perfection, more or less. They don't have the rapid victory that they'd hoped for, but they do trap the Africa Corps near Tunis and forces it to surrender about 100,000 men in January of 1943. So here you can see American forces splashing ashore in North Africa. They're going to occupy these former French colonies, and then they're going to move against German forces around the area of Tunis, which is where Rommel's forces are going to be forced to pull back to. Well, after securing North Africa, a lot of the American generals were kind of prodding the Brits, their allies, and they're going to say, hey, let's go right after the Germans. Let's go right after them across the English Channel. We got our little warm-up out of the way. Yeah, we didn't do so great at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. We think we kind of learned our lesson fighting the Germans. We're ready to go after them. The Brits, though, whoa, easy. Easy, big fella, right? You guys didn't fight the Germans like we did in 1940, and they thrashed us. We're not going to go after the Germans headlong. We'll have to get in boats and we'll have to attack the fortified French coast. I don't think so. I don't think so, right? The Brits said, no, we need to stick to an indirect approach. And of course the Americans, well, you guys had a little more experience with this. We would really like to attack the Germans directly, but okay, what do you propose? This was especially the brainchild of Winston Churchill. He said, we really ought to attack the Germans' weak co-partners in this, and that is the Italians, right? We should attack Southern Europe via Italy. If we can get the Italians, okay, to pull out of this war, then we'll be able to drive right into southern Germany with this, okay? The Brits are going to win this debate. The Americans acquiesce. They do attack the island of Sicily in preparation for attacking the Italian mainland. the attack on Sicily really should have opened a lot of Allied eyes to what was going to take place in the Italian mainland, because you've got this rocky, nasty, mountainous kind of terrain with some really bitter fighting that takes place. And the Germans managed to basically get everybody away. They really failed to trap any of the major sections of the Axis forces, and they're going to escape to the mainland and prepare these large-scale defenses. And so you can see the Brits are going to land on the southeastern shore, the Americans are going to land on the southwestern shore, this part of Sicily, and then they're going to move this way, and they're eventually going to push the Axis forces back into this pocket around Messina, but then they're just going to pull out and get away to the Italian mainland. So here, American forces are splashing ashore in Sicily, and here you can see the battle map. This is the Brits as they're going up the east coast, and the Americans would move along on the north coast. All right, well, we got Sicily out of the way, and we should be able to land in Italy now. And that's exactly what's going to take place in September of 1943. The Allies are going to land along the mainland. The Americans are going to land near the town of Salerno. Politically, it turns out that Churchill was dead right. The Italians, who would much rather eat a plate of spaghetti and sing in an opera rather than fighting a war, realized that Mussolini's led them the wrong way. They were going to revolt against Mussolini's power, they're going to arrest him, and they're going to sue for peace. Literally within a span of a few days, Italy is going to go from being an Axis ally to being a neutral ally to being an ally of the Americans and the Brits. All right. Well, what Churchill was right about politically, he was wrong about militarily. All right. And Hitler had long feared that the Italians would back out on him, and he realizes that he just can't give up this important piece of real estate and just give up the Italians to the entire Italian peninsula to the Allies. He had sent secret orders to his military that in the event of an Italian defection, they were to take over the peninsula as quickly as possible, and that's exactly what's going to take place. He sends in special forces guys, these SS Fallschirmjägers, to rescue Mussolini himself, and he puts him back in charge of the area, but only the parts of Italy that were still under Axis control. So essentially you have two Italys. You have Axis Italy under Mussolini, you have Allied Italy under the King, and Axis Italy is ever shrinking as the Allied armies advance. Well, it turns out that this quick jaunt through Italy that Churchill had promised isn't going to materialize. Right? The war in Italy drags on because the Allies can't make serious headway. Right? Even though the Germans are badly outnumbered, they are expert at using the narrow bottlenecks of these little mountain passes in this mountainous terrain to set up deadly ambushes and fortified position after fortified position. They're going to slow the Allies up the entire Italian peninsula, and it's not until the spring of 1945 that they finally work their way into what is southern Germany. So no quick victory seems possible for the Axis forces. This is Otto Skorzeny. This is this giant sort of bear of a man that is going to be the guy that's going to rescue Mussolini from his mountaintop prison here to get him back in charge of the Axis forces. As I've long contended, nothing really explains warfare quite as well as plastic soldiers, which validates for the most part much of my childhood. But this is a good example of fighting in Italy with these guys. While it's a little plastic figurines, it gives you an idea. This little troop of American soldiers, they're pretty strong, right? They've got guys with semi-automatic rifles, they got a machine gunner, they got a tank with them, right? You got a light tank here. But the fact that they've got to work their way around these positions, this narrow little hairpin turn with this little bottleneck, you got one German guy with a machine gun, maybe an anti-tank device, and he can hold up this whole group of guys for an extended period of time because of the nature of the terrain. This is Battle of Monte Cassino. This is British forces trying to scale this central hilltop with this medieval cathedral on it. They're trying to get up there. The Germans have the high ground of the Po River Valley, and so this is going to be an incredibly deadly, nasty affair that's going to consume a lot of lives, and it's going to allow the relatively outnumbered Germans to have a major tactical advantage over the invaders. So, when we consider what's going on the Eastern Front in 1943, right, Hitler's forces are kind of licking their wounds after the Stalingrad disaster, but Hitler is by no means defeated at this point. In fact, Hitler sees an opportunity following a few German counterattacks to cut off several Russian armies near the city of Kursk in basically the same way the Russians did to him at the city of Stalingrad. There was this big bulge in the Russian line, and so Hitler wanted to come in with a double pincer move and cut it off, right? he orders massive tank forces from both the north and the south to converge on the city of Kursk. Now, the Russians had learned of the attack from one, their spy network, and then two, just common sense. And they have a lot of time to prepare defenses for this. Right? What ensues at the Battle of Kursk here in the summer of 1943 is the largest tank battle in the history of the world. Okay? The Germans are going to kill more Russians and knock out more tanks, but they lose so many of their own tanks and men in the process that really they're forced to retreat from this attack and can never make great advances again. What that means now is, following the Battle of Kursk, is the Russians are going to be on offense and the Germans are going to be on defense for the rest of the war. This is the battle map to give you an idea of what's going on here with the Battle of Kursk. Kursk is in the center of this big bulge of the line. The plan here is for the Russians, or the Germans rather, to come in and cut off these massive forces in this salient. And here, if you were to go to the cyclorama that they have put up in Kursk, Russia, you can see all these knocked out tanks, German tanks, Russian tanks, all these guys, all of these huge battlefields. Major tank fighting took place near the small village of Prokhorovka. Fighters being shot down left and right, tanks and all this kind of destruction that takes place as a result of that. As I mentioned before, the Ju-87 was outfitted with anti-tank guns, 37 millimeter kind of beastly cannons that shoot at the roofs of these tanks with this. One of the other major factors of World War II is a lot of fighting is taking place in the air. Now, despite the fact that the Germans have an early advantage, by the end of the war, the Allies have a massive superiority in terms of air power, thanks to largely their industrial aircraft output. All right. What that means is the Allies are going to be able to limit these attacks by the Germans, especially as the war went on, and it also gives Allied ground forces a great deal of mobility, while hindering the ability for the Axis to move forces around the ground without getting shot at from the air. Also, when you put this into strategic perspective, the Allies are able to mount ever-increasing bombing attacks on German cities, factories, railway yards, oil refineries, power plant facilities, all those kind of things, to try to destroy their ability to make the material and move the material of war. All right? Now, these bombing raids are not decisive. They're probably not going to end the war by themselves, but they are going to devastate the German war industry. Here you can see members of the American 8th Air Force. They're bombing these cities here inside Germany and inside occupied countries. And you got these big bombers that are being escorted by American fighters, and of course the German fighters trying to fly their way up and shoot these guys down, which led to a great deal of dogfighting over the skies of Europe. One of the other major advantages that you've got is a tactical air force, where you can shoot at tanks and trucks and things like that on the ground. Here you can see American fighters launching rockets at ground targets. They're able to shoot down German aircraft to get them out of the way. American fighters are going to be able to drop bombs on German tanks, and this is going to be another part of the Allied victory formula. But the problem with this, of course, is the devastation that's going to take place. Not all these bombs are going to land exactly where you want them to. In fact, almost none of them do. And so when you go back and say, why are they dropping these huge carpets and carpets and carpets of these bombs? It's not because there was that much that needed to be destroyed. It's just most of them are going to miss. So you just drop a whole bunch of them and hope that some of them hit what you're aiming at. And what that means is there's going to be a huge amount of collateral damage in terms of humanity, in terms of the infrastructure of these cities. Some of them are going to be firebombed from the sky. And they're going to cause massive amount of devastation. And so this is going to be a major problem for post-war cleanup. Well, the indirect approach against Hitler hadn't really worked, right? We attacked North Africa, that didn't, it worked okay. We attacked Sicily, we attacked Italy. Finally, we're going to see the Americans are going to win over their British detractors, right? That Italy wasn't going to be the quick victory that they wanted. You're also seeing here that Stalin was pushing for the opening of a viable Western Front to take some pressure off of his armies, all right? So there's no way, really, to get around the fact that these guys are going to have to put some boots on the ground in France. What that means, though, is they're going to have to attack Hitler's Atlantic Wall, something that Hitler often referred to as Festung Europa, right, or Fortress Europe, that he had been building. And this is no small feat, all right? The guy who's going to spearhead this Western war effort is going to be the American General Dwight David Eisenhower. His nickname is Ike. And he is going to be the overall commander of the Army, Navy, Air Assault on Western Europe. As I mentioned, Hitler had commanded his forces in this region to build extensive fortification on the beaches, the cliffs, these areas. But strategically, he expected the Allies to launch the attack near the French city of Calais, because this was the narrowest point of the English Channel. They had to traverse the least amount of distance, and so that seems to be the one that makes the most sense. However, what you're going to see is this is exactly what the Allies wanted to think. Okay? One of the great American Army commanders at that point was George S. Patton, who is going to be in command of a fictional army right across the channel from Calais, to try to fake the Germans into thinking that the invasion is going to take place there. Okay? The real invasion site is in fact going to be the Normandy beaches further south. Right? Now, training millions of troops to be able to embark onto ships and to be able to hit a beach and drop out of airplanes and find these crossings of roads on land at night and things like that. It takes a lot of training, a lot of coordination between land, naval, and air units. Okay, the training is going to take at least a year. All right, with preparation for coordinating all types of men, all different types of equipment. This is going to be the largest amphibious operation in the history of the world. And this little map here, this overall diagram, kind of gives you an idea of the fortifications that these Allied forces are going to have to face. These massive steel reinforced concrete bunkers, these huge guns, cannons, and machine guns, and all sorts of other problems. Right? This is eventually going to lead to D-Day. Right? Now, the first phase of the Normandy landings called for a parachute drop of 3 divisions behind the German lines the night before the invasion. There will be 1 British division and 2 American divisions, and the plan was for the paratroopers to cause general confusion amongst the Germans and also block reinforcements into the area. They were, if possible, going to be able to hold open key bridges and roads for the main invasion force coming from the beaches to go then into the interior. Right? These guys are going to fight cut off for several days. They're going to be behind German lines. They're going to make whatever units they can because they're dropped off in darkness while they're getting shot at by German anti-aircraft fire. Despite these difficulties, these troopers are going to accomplish their goals. And so this is going to be the overall Normandy area. From west to east, we're going to see Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches with the parachute drops behind these lines. So this is what it would look like if you could have seen in the dark night sky of these paratroopers coming down. This is British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division for the Brits, and they're dropping in their zones as well. This is the 101st Airborne Division in Saint-Marie-de-Glace. This is the first French town liberated by Allied forces under the German occupation. So, all right, well, that's the airdrop. Phase 2 is that these soldiers are going to have to be loaded on these transport vessels. Right? For the most part, Higgins boats that were constructed in New Orleans, Louisiana, and delivered safely to these beaches of Normandy. Right? Now, the Air Force for this had to have driven off the Luftwaffe to prevent them from strafing the beaches and causing chaos. They also had to pin down the German tank forces in the rear area to make sure that the Germans couldn't break through to the beaches and slaughter these guys on the shore. Finally, something's got to be done to silence these large guns on the coast to prevent them from sinking the invasion fleet while they're in the water. So the air forces are going to be very, very busy while these guys are embarking on their journey across the channel. The actual landing itself is going to require perfect weather. Okay? The Allies are going to have to get on land in 3 major beach areas to gain a large enough bridgehead. Utah Beach looked like it was going to be an okay objective. The 3 British-Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, those looked like they were going to be pretty attainable. The problem with this is the one in the middle, Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach was the one that had the biggest cliffs, the narrowest gorges to try to operate through, and it proved to be the most deadly. But there was nothing for it. Otherwise, you're just going to have 2 wings coming ashore in Normandy, and you've got to have a continuous front, so somebody's got to storm the beaches by direct assault. Some of these units that storm the shore at Omaha Beach are going to lose 97% of their men. But as waves of Americans continue to storm over the cliff forts, working their way up these cliffs through essentially small unit bravery, they would finally find their way behind them, and they would capture them, and they would force the Germans to surrender. Now, the plan had been to move further inland on day 1 itself, on D-Day. But the problem was, by the time they had captured the beach areas, the troops were simply too tired and fought out, and the Germans were too heavily dug in to prevent any further advance. One of the things, too, that had escaped a lot of Allied planners' notice was they had planned for attacking the beaches for a year. They really hadn't spent a lot of time planning what they were going to do beyond that. and they had failed to notice that the Normandy hedgerow country, where you get these narrow little areas with these high banked hedges, created these natural sort of funnels that are going to allow the outnumbered Germans, again, to bottleneck the Allies along the beach area. And so more and more time is going to pass before the Allies are going to finally fight their way out of the Normandy bottlenecks in this hedgerow country. So these are American soldiers. They're wading them ashore, and you can see the high French cliffs at Omaha Beach in the background. This is a scene from the film Saving Private Ryan. You can see the amphibious tanks that they tried to employ to get ashore. A lot of these guys are being cut down left and right, and of course then the beach obstacles that the Germans had put up with this. And here you can see some Americans are waiting to come ashore at Utah Beach, and then here are some Canadians coming ashore at the Canadian beaches on the eastern end of the line. This artist rendition of this kind of relief map gives you an idea of how difficult this was for the Allies to come ashore. You get these huge cliffs, and then you get these just narrow little draws that lead into the interior. Then, of course, the Germans naturally are going to be covering with heavy cannon and machine gun fire with this, right? Finally, you're going to see using air power, the Allies are going to break out of the Normandy bridgehead, and they're going to race across now the much more open fields of the rest of France, and they're going to start liberating French towns and cities all over the place, including the capital of Paris. So by the winter of 1944, Hitler is in a bad situation. He faces the Russian army moving in from his eastern border and the British and the Americans moving in on the western border. But throughout this period of late 1944, Hitler had been marshaling his forces into one sort of last reserve force. The question was, who are you going to use it against? Logic might dictate somebody comes to Hitler and says, listen, bro, it's over, okay? We're not going to win the war, but we don't want these communist weirdos coming in and taking over Germany. So let's use this army. We throw back the Russians, get them out of the way. We just kind of open the door for the Americans and the Brits to come in. They'll be fairly nice to us. That's probably best case scenario. Hitler, no. He's still trying to win the war despite the fact that, it's not going to happen. So he makes his decision based on the fact that, okay, well, which of these guys is most likely to be defeated? If we throw this army against the Russians will just retreat back into Russia, and you get this huge space. They're never going to be, it's not a big enough army to defeat all the Russians. However, if we throw them against the Americans and the Brits, it's such a narrow terrain that if we can break through like we did in 1940, then we might be able to trap them in a pocket in 1944, and if they pull out of the war, then we can transfer all of our forces on the Western Front to the Eastern Front, and we may be able to still win. If this seems like a ridiculously long gamble, it is. But that's exactly what happens here, is Hitler begins moving his forces west to try to break through the American and the British lines in the snowy Ardennes forest. And that's going to lead us to the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler is going to catch the Americans completely off guard. We're also going to see that bad weather here in December of 1944 is going to put most of the aircraft on the ground, thus nullifying the Americans' massive advantage in air power. The Germans are going to make a huge bulge in the American line, but the difference here is, unlike the French in 1940, the Americans in 1944, they don't break. They give ground, but they keep fighting. And they don't create a hole large enough for the Germans to break through. We're also going to see that the strategic element of the bombing campaigns is going to be prevalent here as the Germans run out of fuel. Their industry can't provide enough gas. Their plan was to capture as much of the fuel stocks from these American fuel depots as possible, and the Germans simply can't go forward fast enough to do this. Also, we're going to see that a few days later, the weather is finally going to clear, just as these German tanks are kind of stalled, and they are going to make these German armored columns pay. All right? They're going to start dive bombing these Germans left and right, driving them back out of the pocket, and so by the end of the Battle of the Bulge, the lines are going to wind up more or less like they were before that. Right? The Germans are kind of pushed back to kind of where they were before. The difference is, though, that Germany now has no more major land reserves of forces that they can throw into any of these kinds of fightings. So I got this little scene from a video game too. You learn a lot from video games. But this is one gives you an idea of kind of how nasty and how narrow the terrain is fighting here in the snowy Ardennes forest of 1944. So here's some American forces. They form these little ad hoc units as best as they can to go forward and fight the Germans in these snowy conditions. The winter of 1944 was bitterly cold. There was an American soldier who fought here in the Battle of the Bulge and came home and he wrote a poem called "I Will Never Be Cold Again." because he was so bitterly cold during the fighting here that nothing since then could possibly compare to that kind of thing. Now, this is another scene from a video game, but it gives you an idea of kind of what the tanks were that the Germans had at their disposal. This was their last kind of major throw. You can see some Stug assault guns, some Panzer IVs, some Tiger tanks, some Panther tanks, some Tiger IIs. The Germans really kind of threw the cream of their armored columns at the Allies here in the fighting. But eventually, as I said, the weather would clear and Allied fighter bombers were going to wreak havoc on these German columns. And so the map gives you a good idea of why it lines up with the name that it does, right? Which is the Battle of the Bulge, because the Germans never break completely through. They just create this huge bulge in the line, except of course for the airborne forces that are holding on to the surrounded city of Bastogne. All right. So during the spring of 1945, it's pretty obvious that all right, this is going to be over, right? And the Western Allies and the Russians, they start pouring into Germany. The Western Allies are going to race across and take the western 2/3 of the country. The Russians are going to take the remaining part of this country, remaining third of the country, but it also includes the capital of Berlin. It turns out that Berlin, despite all the nasty fighting that had taken place all around Europe, Berlin is actually the bloodiest battle of the entire war. The Germans fighting to hang on to their capital, the Russians fighting to try to see, to try to take this, and this is the one that's going to cause the most amount of bloodshed. Right? Hitler actually he decides, well, the jig's up. He doesn't want to be a prisoner and be paraded through the streets like a dog, so he commits suicide. He commits suicide during the war's final days, and he is going to leave others to surrender for him in May of 1945. So the European war is over. This is often referred to as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. But devastation is going to reign all over the continent. And so here you can see American forces moving through the West Wall and west, Russian tanks on the streets of Berlin in the east. But this is much of Germany, and this is much of the rest of Europe. It's fought over, bombed out, and destroyed. All right? Now, throughout much of the fighting in the Pacific, the United States had borne most of the war in that part of the world against Japan. China was also fighting against the Japanese on the mainland of Asia, but at sea, the Japanese Empire had been moving steadily backwards from the Battle of Midway in 1942 all the way to 1945. The problem with this was the United States is facing the abject horror of trying to invade Japan and its hordes of fanatic defenders. Ever increasingly, the United States was running into a Japanese army that simply refused to surrender. These guys would fight to the death. The emperor was, on the one hand, a political figure, but he was also a religious figure in the Japanese Shinto religion. And so when the Japanese tell the Americans, we're not going to give up, and they start crashing their planes into U.S. ships in suicide attacks, okay, we need to take these guys seriously. And then when the emperor announces that we're going to train everybody in Japan to everybody is going to fight the invaders, we're going to take you guys really, really seriously. All right? New U.S. president is going to be Harry Truman. Franklin Roosevelt is going to die in the spring of 1945. And when his military planners come to him and he says, okay, if we're going to invade Japan, what are we going to be looking at? Right? When Truman asks his military planners, okay, what kind of casualties are we going to be looking at here? We're expecting 1 million casualties. These are staggering kind of numbers, right? And if you consider the fact that for the most part, the Americans are going to be forced to fight civilians, and if you look at, what is it, like a 10-to-1 kill ratio, a 20-to-1 kill ratio, where the Americans are fighting, these troops are fighting, with kids and old people in the streets, you look at like 20 million dead Japanese. I mean, this is brutish, horrible kind of numbers. And so Truman begins to look for some way to get the Japanese to surrender via something other than let's invade the island and kill them all with, bullets. And what he settles on is the product of the American Manhattan Project, which was the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb, or the Manhattan Project, produced 3 atomic bombs, and they decided to test one to see what it would do. And it turns out that what it did was pretty impressive. The United States used one of these bombs first on Hiroshima on August 9th of 1945. What the United States had hoped for was Japan, realizing the United States had a bomb that could annihilate a city in one shot, they would give up immediately. Instead, Japan drug its feet. They didn't surrender. They refused to acknowledge this. In fact, if you read Hirohito's papers, Hirohito actually called one of his top scientists in and said, hey, how long until we can get a bomb like this? Really kind of out of touch with reality. And then so the United States drops another bomb, actually, ironically, its entire nuclear payload at that point, on another Japanese city of Nagasaki, which, of course, both of these were annihilated instantly. Finally, scales fall from Hirohito and his government's eyes, and they realize they're going to have to surrender to the Allies. Japan is going to surrender unconditionally, Victory over Japan Day, which is VJ Day. The Russians also, though, are put on notice that, hey, the United States has a war-changing weapon, so this was also a subtle political jab by the Truman administration, because they don't really trust the communists in Moscow. Hey, we've got a weapon that you don't have. So here's the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. This is the one over Nagasaki. As I mentioned, both of these cities are totally annihilated as a result of that. These are the ministers of the Japanese government signing the instruments of surrender aboard the USS Missouri under the auspices of commanding U.S. General Douglas MacArthur. As the news spreads out around the world, you've got excitement all over the place as soldiers realize they're not going to have to go overseas and die anymore. And so you can see one of the famous scenes where the sailor just grabs his nurse on the streets of New York and smooches her. Right? As World War II had been winding down, one of the things that the Russians, the United States, and the British had realized was, okay, somebody's going to have a guiding hand over what the post-war world is going to look like. We've had 2 of these world wars now. We really need to get serious about not having any more. All right? The United States, especially under Roosevelt, had been pretty trusting of the Russians. And they allowed the Russians to administer their own areas while the West would rebuild the territories that it had overrun with its military. We're also going to see the formation of the United Nations. Originally, the United Nations was this alliance of nations to fight the Germans, but they were going to, the proposal from the United States was that they wanted it to continue on as a body to prevent World War III. This would give all nations a forum for their grievances. All right? Now, Stalin is going to use these agreements not for spreading liberty and freedom and all that kind of stuff, but basically expanding communism by force a lot of times. Some good examples, this is going to be China and Eastern Europe. So there's Churchill, there's President Roosevelt, there's Stalin, they're pretending to like each other, right, with this one. And then eventually we will see that with the election of a new British Prime Minister, Attlee, and with the death of President Roosevelt, the ascension of then Vice President Harry Truman, and the only constant with this is going to be that the Potsdam meeting is going to be Stalin in charge of this. And this is the table where they sat around and they started divided up the world. They got out the little carving knives. You're going to get this, you're going to get that. This is what we're going to do. And so World War II is over, but as you can kind of sense from the tension in the room, that not all of the world's problems are solved.